And today I want to start with the Epicureans, but beginning that with some comments about the Cyrenaics. Okay? Both the Cyrenaics and the Cynics, whom we'll come to later on, are spoken of by Kaufmann in his introduction to material on this period as Socratic schools. And yet as you read them, you'll think they're most unlike Socrates, or read about them, you'll think they're most unlike Socrates. The Socratic note simply represents a point of departure, not a point of agreement. Their point of departure, both the Cyrenaics and the Cynics, is Socrates' famous dictum, know thyself. Know thyself. Which in Socrates, of course, had to do with a self-understanding which could lead into a process of improvement of the soul. And that was not altogether alien to the Cyrenaics and Cynics, but what the soul was and what they thought would improve it is markedly different. The Cyrenaics particularly stand in contrast because they are so plainly hedonists. That is to say, the good is pleasure. And it was a very individualized pursuit of pleasure, and so it is an egoistical hedonism. My pleasure. Egoistical hedonism. But in the history of ethics, they stand as, I think, the first clear-cut school of thought advocating the maximum pleasure of the maximum intensity and the maximum immediacy, if you please. The maximum pleasure of the maximum intensity and the maximum immediacy. It's sort of an extreme hedonism. Now, how did they get to that? How did they get to that from Socrates' know thyself? Well, the purpose of knowing yourself is to understand what will give you enjoyment. If you know what gives you enjoyment, what gives you pleasure, then you can pursue pleasure. And so self-understanding becomes an instrument for hedonistic purposes. Knowing, for the Cyrenaic, is a matter of sense experience. And it's in our sense experience that we enjoy pleasure or feel pain. And the pleasurable sensations are what we call good. We desire them. The painful sensations we call bad. We try to avoid them. Notice the fact that its sensation implies that it's a physically based sort of thing primarily. There is no universal norm as to what all people find pleasurable. It's just that each individual seeks to maximize the pleasure for herself, for himself. Now, a couple of qualifications. They recognize that unrestrained excess produces pain the morning after the night before, and therefore want to avoid such unrestrained excess. In other words, stay master of yourself, of your environment. Be reasonable in that way. But of course, being reasonable is just a means to a hedonistic end. Okay? Now, that description is characteristic of Aristippus of Cyrene. Cyrene, of course, in North Africa. And it's from that location that the term Cyrenaic derives. The other individual whose name has come down to us in this connection is Agasius, who distinguished himself by, while still a hedonist, being a pessimist about life. That is to say, the maximum pleasure we can have is complete absence of pain. We can't really produce any surplus of pleasure in this life. So since the happiest outcome is painlessness, the best thing to do is to end it all. And he became a counselor of suicide. It's said that he was separated from his teaching job because he was losing students, and understandably. But it's an interesting sort of outcome, but it's not the only one of that sort. To begin with, there's a whole literature on the ethics of suicide, beginning back there with Agasius, and more lately in the 20th century, the French existential writer Albert Camus. In between, lots of others. And frequently, those who find justification for suicide do it on a hedonistic basis. On a hedonistic basis. That is to say, if you want to minimize the pain, maximize pleasure, and there's no surplus of pleasure possible, then to minimize the pain, what is left? You see. And so that sort of rationalization at that juncture. Well, the Cyrenaics are an interesting beginning of hedonistic ethics, an extreme sort that soon is moderated. And in the course of time, the Cyrenaics simply were absorbed into the growing Epicurean movement, which is a more moderate kind of hedonism, more moderate version. And the two names of importance for us in Epicureanism, one is Epicurus, obviously gave his name to this, and the other is the Roman poet of the 1st century, Lucretius, whose work, The Nature of Things, is a extended philosophical poem. There are blank verse translations available, and if you're interested in poetry that describes a whole mechanistic cosmology and develops out of it a theory of sense perception, an ethic and a political theory, all in one massive long blank verse poem, then by all means take a look at The Nature of Things. Since The Nature of Things is rather vague, some modern versions have been given it the title The Nature of the Universe, which makes it equally inclusive, of course. It's just that it sounds a bit better than The Nature of Things. What are things? Well, the whole universe and everything, you see. And that's really what the poem is about. Well, the Epicurean poem, then, on the nature of things, the Lucretius poem, rather, is really an attempt to systematize, to develop further, what Epicurus had done in the 3rd century BC. Lucretius in the 1st century BC. Epicurus in the 3rd. And the conception of pleasure which they emphasize, they spoke of as ataraxia. ataraxia. Those of you with some Greek will recognize the alpha privative, which is a negative prefix, and the verb tarasso, which is to harass, to trouble, to buffet, to knock around. So ataraxia is, as they defined it, freedom from pain in the body and trouble in the soul. Freedom from pain in the body and trouble in the soul. So the pleasure-pain question is tied to both body and soul. Okay, freedom from pain in the body, trouble in the soul. Some commentators have noted that that moderation may have been due to the fact that Epicurus had stomach ulcers and so had to avoid pain in the body, and therefore moderated the physical side of the hedonism at least. But in any case, what they are seeking is a life of contentment. A life of contentment that has found freedom from all that might disturb, upset, harass. And for that reason, Epicurus and Lucretius make a qualitative difference between pleasures. It's easy enough to think of quantitative differences between pleasures. This is more painful than that, or this is more pleasurable than that. But as soon as you start trying to do that, you begin to see that the differences aren't entirely a matter of quantity. You can say the dentist who numbs the gums produces less pain than one who doesn't. A quantitative comparison that way is easy enough. But how do you compare the pain of a toothache with the pain of a jilted lover? I mean, that's apples and oranges. How do you compare them? The qualitative thing is so much more difficult. And yet it's so essential. And so they're concerned then with qualitative distinctions that are measured not in quantitative terms, but in terms of high quality as against low quality. High as against low quality. Where the higher quality pleasures, of course, are pleasures of good company, good friends, the pleasures of education, the pleasure of living in a just society, of having what nature requires, rather than constantly overindulging. So the higher pleasures. And the point is that the higher pleasures are more intrinsically pleasurable, are more intrinsically, in and of themselves, pleasurable. Friendship, good company, learning, so forth, more intrinsically. Well, this is the kind of hedonism at which they aim, but the most significant thing about it is that they try to ground this hedonism in a metaphysic. And the metaphysic that it's grounded in is the atomism, the atomistic materialism of Democritus. Now, remember Democritus. Back to the pre-Socratics. You were warned that we'd have to have them at our fingertips. Democritus was the pluralist who maintained that everything is composed of atoms in empty space, produced by some sort of a cosmic vortex which whirls these atoms of various shapes and sizes around, and they combine to form larger compounds, and everything that results out of this chance process, producing the kind of world in which we live. Well, very, very similar, with simply one particular difference that comes up with Lucretius and Epicurus. That is to say, instead of the cosmic vortex whirling things around, they take what appears to them to be a more obvious empirical standpoint. Everything is constantly falling down. So that the natural motion of atoms is simply vertical fall, vertical fall. And it's out of that, the collisions that occur, the compounds result. Now, in order to get at the way in which he develops that, let's take a look at the Epicurus selections, beginning on page 454. Beginning on page 454. The picture which he poses here is a classic picture of this kind of materialism. Classic picture of it. It's one which was picked up in the Renaissance with the scientific revolution that took place then. Because as you're aware, that scientific revolution in the 16th, 17th century, involving Galileo, Copernicus, systematized in Newton, was a move to a mechanistic kind of explanation, so that the whole physical universe is explained in terms of the movement of particles of matter under the impact of physical forces. And the advocates of that science very freely cited Democritus as the person who impressed them most. In fact, when we get to the philosophers Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, we find they cite Democritus too, and appeal to this kind of Democritan atomism. So the picture we have then is one that is of lasting importance. Updated in some ways, yes. Okay, on 454, in the first column, the center paragraph, second sentence, you notice this to begin with, nothing comes into being out of what is non-existent. Now, this is a classic Greek dictum, classic in Roman thought as well, in Latin, ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Nothing comes into being out of what is non-existent. And that, of course, is characteristic of all the pre-Socratics. It's characteristic of Plato and of Aristotle. The elements are eternal. The atoms are eternal, in this case. If everything is made from atoms and empty space, then atoms and empty space must be eternal, uncreated. Okay? So there's the basic stuff. Indeed, this is how he goes on in the next paragraph. He says the whole of being consists of bodies and space. And just across on the next column, the sum of things is unlimited because of the multitude of atoms and the extent of the void. The multitude of atoms, the extent of the void. No finite number and infinite number. Vast, endless. So the basic ingredients are pretty plain. On 455, first complete paragraph, the atoms are in continual motion through all eternity. And then the following paragraph points out that they exist from everlasting. Atoms and a void. Later on, he says they come in different shapes, somewhat different sizes. Later on 457, if you want to check that, 457, he points out that while they have different shapes, different weight, different size, that's all we can say from observation. He's making a distinction that becomes very important between primary qualities and secondary qualities, as they get to be called later on. Primary qualities being spatial properties, okay, size, shape, spatial occupancy, density, therefore weight, but not secondary qualities. That is to say, the qualities that we are aware of by particular sense organs. Color, smell, taste, sound, feeling, texture, you see. Not secondary qualities. In the 16th, 17th century, this amounts to the fact that the primary qualities are viewed as objectively real. Properties of things, physical bodies. Secondary qualities are viewed as subjective. Qualities only of your experience. Subjective. Qualities only of your experience. Now, to make that distinction requires a theory of sense perception. How does sense perception work? That the secondary qualities should be all subjective. And Epicurus suggests how sense perception works on page 455, top of the second column, new paragraph, where he says there are outlines or films which are of the same shape as solid bodies, but very thin, so that we cannot see it, these transparent films that sort of peel off from physical bodies. If they're transparent, they have no color. You can't see them. But these films, moving through space, enter through the sense organs, through the eyes, for instance, and are perceived within. And being perceived within, shrunk, but they retain the same shape. And so we perceive shapes without color, without smell, without secondary qualities. So that the secondary qualities are qualities of our experience produced in the process, but not qualities of external objects. Okay? So that's basically the theory that you find in John Locke in the late 17th century. That secondary qualities may be caused ultimately by physical stimuli in conjunction with the mind, the brain, our physical apparatus, but are purely subjective, are produced subjectively. They have no objective reality. After all, in this materialist, mechanistic universe, remember Tennyson's line, can I take a thing so dead, embrace it for my mortal good? Colorless, odorless, feelingless, this dead material world. You see? Now that's the kind of picture that develops later on, and it begins to be implicit here in Epicurus. Empty space, then, is unbounded in every direction. The atoms are falling vertically in space. How, then, do they collide to produce any possible changes, combinations? And it's Lucretius who makes this very plain. He suggests that in the process of falling, an occasional atom, for no known reason or cause, will swerve off course. The Lucretian swerve. It's like a brilliant a ball pitched in baseball that swerves on its way, and so produces things. Well, this swerving atom, then, tends to set up a chain reaction, like a collision on the freeway. Collision after collision, combination after combination occurring. And fanciful though it seems, what he's trying to say is that there is an element of indeterminacy and unpredictability in nature. An element of indeterminacy and unpredictability in nature. And it's by virtue of that, an element of causal indeterminacy, that there is that phenomenon that we think of as human freedom, which is really something that occurs when there's a gap in otherwise unbroken causal shapes. So it's that causal indeterminacy, then,